All right, here we are. Well, hello everyone. Thanks for joining. Hey David, hey Brad, how are you guys? Well, for all of you who checked out some of the stuff about what we're going to talk about, or maybe seen some of the slides earlier, but we'll talk quite a bit about how we, look at what readiness means for buildings, both from
All right,
a
here we are.
uh,
Well,
standpoint
hello.
of the let's say the way in which we look at data, the way we in which we process it, and how we prepare it, and what all of that actually even means. I'm not the expert. The experts are David and Brad, so they're both going to introduce each other and share more about what their context is from. But I'll just kick off with myself. Essentially, Rami here. Method and Build is basically a project with related to go-to-market operations for building product manufacturers, particularly on the early stage. But this media side has really not much to do with that as much as it has to do with just the built environment and matters that are very relevant and timely, and looking at it from lenses that can add some practical considerations for anyone practicing today or considering how they can improve their own projects. So, without further ado, Brad, David, introduce yourselves.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me here. Glad to join. I'm Brad Hargraves. I am founder and editor-in-chief of Thesis Driven. We write about the future of the built world and the real estate industry in particular, and we analyze that across lenses of technological innovation, financial innovation, and macro social and cultural changes. We've been doing that for about 3 years. We publish twice a week, and we also have a handful of data products and teach courses around the real estate industry. Prior to that, I built a multifamily operating platform called Common, focused on innovative multifamily. And at the beginning of my career, started a trade school, General Assembly, teaching technology and design skills.
Hey everyone, my name is David Bowman. I'm an engineer, generally software and electrical. I've done a lot of work across a lot of industries that I've sold a couple of startups. A large part of my experience was in commercial real estate acquisitions and using machine learning and now AI to kind of procure and use that data in an intelligent way. But my background's generally across quite a few industries, which gives me, I think, a kind of nice understanding of how AI functions, outside of commercial real estate and maybe how it's not being best utilized there currently.
hmm Yeah, well, we'd be excited to dig into that actually. We might as well kick it off maybe from that standpoint. But before we do that, just for the audience to get a level field of how we're going to go through things, we're really going to go from David's perspective on like the sourcing and acquisition side and move into Brad's perspective around the operations, value creation to sort of understand even how they relate to each other. So maybe David, kick us off with what you just mentioned there. So what is it that you're observing that, is not being utilized properly, and the segments there that are maybe a bit misunderstood or misaligned?
Yeah, sure. Let me take kind of a quick 30 to 60 seconds to kind of explain AI from like an engineering perspective, like
hmm
especially when it comes to scaling operations. Like AI is a interesting tool, but it's really just kind of an extension really of machine learning in both a positive and a negative way. With machine learning, you pump in a bunch of data and you get some answers, and then you push in more data and you say like it's either statistically significant or not. And you build out these kind of algorithmic models to better understand your world. AI can take in larger quantities of data, and it's a little bit more vague, but it processes in a unique way with general understanding that provides a lot of outputs. So it's kind of like it's a little bit of a vibe where you push in a bunch of stuff and you might get outputs you didn't expect. In some ways this is good, but it shares a lot of the same difficulties we had with machine learning. The way which I kind of explain AI is that it's a scalar. Like if you do good work, it will scale your work in a positive direction. If you do poor work,
hmm
it'll scale your work in a poorer direction. So when kind of using AI, similar to machine learning, is it it can't sit there and take over an aspect of your business that you don't understand, But if you already do a good job, you can use it to scale your business in a positive way. So kind of around, data origination, deal collection, etc. Like I helped run, and I still somewhat do help run a commercial real estate agency, or sorry, acquisitions company that, acquires hundreds of millions to billions of dollars of real estate every year, generally in the net lease space. Before we were acquiring our data, through municipalities, through, skip tracing, through kind of the same process that everyone else was. But
Yeah.
with AI, we have a lot better data scraping. We're able to sit there and take a non-systematic approach to collecting original data. But similarly, we have to be a little bit sharper, knowing that there are, less consistent outputs. So the key, our transition from non-AI to AI is we get a whole bunch more data. We come in with recognition that some of it we have to throw out, but as long as we are already good decision makers and have a process of qualification, we find that we don't get lost in the weeds of all this other nonsense. Where there's people that I know who, you buy some type of AI SaaS platform or do all this stuff, but you already have no idea what you're doing, and then all of a sudden you burn through millions of dollars of cash and you ended up with something you didn't think like. But if you already have a good company, it scales in an interesting way. So we found AI has sped up all of our data acquisition processes and given us more data, but we found that, we have to add a couple more checksums to make sure that we're, not making bad decisions and, throwing away a bunch of cash.
Mm. What do you think, Brad? How does that kind of relate to sort of how you're seeing the? I mean, a lot of that was fact, and so at this point, it's how do you apply these facts to your perspective in terms of how you've seen the implementation, I guess, in terms of where it's improved your processes the most. I guess more so to follow up on this very exact thing of here we have more better scraping capabilities, and now we have more data to parse through. What does filtration mean? How do you qualify in a better way? How's all that applied?
Yeah, so my experience is primarily on the operations side. I think there's a lot of interesting things that, developers are starting to get into on the, sourcing side, but that requires some pretty fundamental changes in many of their processes. You see some very data savvy developers getting a real step up right now by being able to implement this and, source off market sites in ways they weren't before and filter through those sites in ways they just like were totally impossible to do in prior years. But where we're seeing it like get broad-based adoption by your average normie operator is more on the consumer-facing operations side.
Mm-hmm.
And that has to do with, your regular interactions with tenants, prospective tenants, this kind of back and forth that you get when someone has a maintenance issue, when someone is curious about a unit in the building and may apply, needs to go through the tenant verification process to get that unit. You're seeing a lot of AI being deployed out in the world right now. Companies like Elise AI, for instance, kind of on the forefront of that and growing incredibly fast. And so we're seeing a lot of momentum around that, and the tailwind for it is that rent growth has mostly stalled. And if you are a multifamily owner operator, if you're a REIT and you want to bump NOI, you have to do that by adding efficiency. And that's where, and some of this is not even AI. I think AI gets thrown around a lot, and it's a sexy term, and everyone likes to put .ai on the end of their domain and call themselves an AI company. A lot of this is just like, I call it sparkling automation. It's 2015 era, deterministic workflows, if this then that kind of stuff. But you know what? God bless. It's a great thing. Like if this interest and buzz around AI is causing people to embrace automation that they should have embraced 10 years ago, that's great. And some of the best things are when you can combine them, where you have some, programmatic elements of, it's just deterministic. This is where a lot of the agentic stuff comes in. But there is an LLM component that is actually doing the interaction piece. So go deeper into that, into what we're seeing in operations, but you're definitely, it's having a moment right now, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And there's macro tailwinds, reasons why it's happening, and also, technical details that make it, frankly, better than it's been, 12, 18, 24 months ago.
And that's actually a key point that you bring up there, which is the deterministic part, right? And what that really means is that there is a clarity in terms of what the steps are needed to be taken to, like, say that this is a successful or expected outcome. And so in real estate, I mean, one could argue that there's obviously always a balance of like deterministic, non-deterministic based on what is the situation. I can only imagine that with tenants, there can be some ambiguity at times, right? So, like, depending on what they're inquiring about. Now, most often, hopefully, they're common use cases, but however we might treat the outliers, I think that's where the interesting part becomes with, let's say, a deterministic workflow by an AI system as it takes in an input, but maybe it's in that, like, gray spot of unsure and you don't want it to do something you don't want it to ever do to a tenant, for example.
Right.
And that, and so maybe could we talk a little bit about that outlier piece and like managing that outlier kind of like incident in some regards?
Well, I mean, I think one thing a lot of multifamily operators debate is like, where do you put humans in the loop, and kind of
Mm-hmm.
how okay are you taking humans out of the loop? And there's some processes and there's some workflows. Let me give you an example of tenant screening, where you really always have to have a human in the loop. So an AI can make a recommendation and say, hey, based on all of this, I think these documents are fraudulent, or I think this tenant passes the screening, but nobody's really fully taken the human out of the loop when it comes to handing the ability to determine and make that final screening decision. Nobody has handed that over to the AI entirely. And there's for compliance reasons as well. I mean, there's a lot of regulation when it comes to, denying someone an apartment, for good reason. And, nobody's fully taken the human out of the loop.
Yeah.
Then you have something like a maintenance ticket. A lot of those very easy. You can say, okay, this is, they want a copy of their lease. Okay, they say there's a leak in their unit. We need to dispatch someone. And then obviously there are situations where either, the AI is unclear,
Yeah.
what the tenant wants, or it's clearly an escalated case, and you want to get that in front of a human. So you're seeing a lot of different paths where this how this can shake out.
I want to kind of add something to that, which I think there's different types of problems I think that people are mentioning. Like we have indeterministic problems and we have deterministic problems. Like if I have to dig a hole, to build a building, right? Like I can calculate the volume of dirt I need to move, etc. Like there's certain things that I don't need AI for. AI handles indeterminate issues, probabilistic answers. And what I mentioned earlier is it kind of scales your current processes. Like if you currently handle customer service issues problem like in a negative way, AI isn't going to teach a person to be respectful on the phone. It's not going to teach them to properly, how to think through an issue. But what we can use AI to do is to quickly qualify the problem, provide resources that might be necessary to solve the problem. Like, for example, when handling tenant issues, like someone submits a ticket that says my hot water isn't working. I can very quickly use AI to process what the ticket's about, communicate, an effective script that's maybe somewhat pre-generated, provide resources to that user even before it gets to a human, determine escalation if a human should see it. Like maybe they're a very important tenant that's in the penthouse of your, paying $50 million a month for rent or whatever, like it solves a lot of these kind of probabilistic tickets that before would say, we'll get back to you in 24 to 48 hours, and saying we can get back to you, near immediately. And maybe we can solve, N percentage of the issues before it even gets to a human for simple, like, hey, I paid my rent. When will I see that reflected in my whatever account? And then already give like a predetermined FAQ answer. So, but it's one of those things that I mentioned before, kind of scales. Like you still need to have your customer service in line. You need to have documented processes that make people happy. You need a way to measure, feedback from tenants, etc. But if you already have that, you can implement AI to scale your good process into a great and quick process. But if you're doing it poorly, you should probably expect that it's going to get worse and people are going to be less happy with you. You can't just sit there and like tell the AI do this better. It's going to scale your current process.
Well, and even at that point, I mean, that's a very interesting point, right? And maybe for many, I can imagine that, as you mentioned, Brad, the normies, right? And even then, we don't want to maybe look at, let's say, the market in that perspective as much as it is. Everyone wants efficiency improvement, like more often than not, right? In their organization, in their operations. And so even then, I guess depending on, and this would be a question to both of you in terms of where do you see the, let's say, the implementation happening within that existing process that a given team has, and where they foresee that they can take on the leadership themselves for any team member to understand that this is a process that they would love to reduce the amount of time they spend on, right? So that they can maybe focus on things that are more on the human side, right? And like, for example, in case of a maintenance inquiry, one doesn't really want to bother with the paperwork or the documentation they need to send to the tenant, right? So that's like a very good example of this is something that, let's say, set some expectation to the tenant that this is something they'll be taking a look into, and maybe the person, let's say, with the facilities management kind of responsibilities, right, is maybe on the call quicker with the person they need to be with, or however they submit the inquiry. But I think this, and this, I would like to segue this a little bit into, as both of you are probably seeing right now, even with buildings, they have all sorts of different criteria for how they perform as a structure. And a good part of this talk should be focused on that as well. And so I'm curious to see both of your ends on sort of, like, for example, as I keep up with building products and things that go into buildings, all these talks on digital twin, right, and understanding your building digitally. We think about AI understanding and parsing this data, and we're looking at preventive maintenance. I think that adds an additional layer of potentially interesting insights or capabilities, I would imagine. So if we, as we zoom more into thinking, okay, what can the building communicate, like beyond the tenants and the occupants and within, but the building itself as it communicates to systems and back and forth? What are some observations there?
So I would say it's first and foremost, it's kind of hard to generalize across real estate in terms of
For sure.
what is possible and where AI even needs to be inserted. I mean, if you're building trophy class A office, you want to get, you want the thermostats to learn when to set temperatures of given times of day based on, learning user inputs and things like that. And that's cool and snazzy and everything. I talk to value add multifamily developers that, buy buildings and they don't even know the number of units in the building. Like, because there will be some, non-paying tenant who's really given trouble, and rather than rather than getting the tenant out, the user will simply scrape the number off the door and remove it from the rent roll and pretend the unit doesn't exist. And so you buy a building that you think is 53 units, and turns out it's actually 54, and there's a crazy person living in the unit that didn't exist on the documentation. So I do think it's important to acknowledge that, when you actually get into the details of the sticks and bricks in real estate, you have very different realities depending on what you're doing in terms of the data quality, the data availability, and the problems you need to solve. But I think the point you made, Rami, around just at a really high level, it's about replacing some of those very rote but unstructured interactions, such as, if you're sitting at the front desk, if you're the leasing agent, you're getting questions all day long, people coming on off the website asking the same question over and over. Is this unit still available? What's the rent on this one? Do you have a 2-bedroom? That could easily be answered by just looking at the website. That data is available. AI can deal with those interactions very easily. Like, that is a a very basic use case, and then that can redirect, allow you to redirect some of your time to doing
So,
tours,
yeah.
like checking on tenants, like following up with tenants who already toured. So there's a lot of, it does unlock more human time. And when I talk to operators about, they first go in being like, oh, can I go cut headcount? Like just start thinking about replacing workflows. Think on a workflow level, not a role level. And maybe over time it has an impact on payroll, but don't go into it like that.
Hmm. And actually, that's actually a good segue also into kind of so you've, as part of thesis driven, the article that this talk is even based on, which will be shared as a resource here at the end. You've developed this framework in 8 categories where you assess all these different, let's say, segments of, let's say, data quality, analytics maturity. And it's more of an assessment, right? To give someone insight into where they are, maybe where they could be, or what they should look into and prioritize. So just kind of thinking about some of them, which ones, as we relate to this conversation, have you seen that the framework has been very useful in kind of helping someone determine that? Because, I mean, to your point, you mentioned replacing workflows. I highly doubt that many teams actually have, let's say, their operations mapped in some kind of chart where they visualize with if else, kind of things. And so everything is just a mental model that exists in that what we, institutional knowledge at its finest right there, right? And so at that point, that kind of gets communicated in different ways. I imagine in some ways there are resources documented somewhere, right, to some degree, but not to a very finite detail that, say, an AI can make sense of sometimes, and there will be some ambiguity for it. So, yeah, share a bit on that.
Yeah, so we built an AI readiness assessment, and it's focused on operators. So it doesn't touch on the acquisitions and sourcing side, solely on operations, with a focus on multifamily. And it really looks at 8 different dimensions, ranging from, your data quality, your data governance process, security and compliance, to just metrics and ROI. So like, how focused are you as an organization? How good are you at measuring the ROI of a given investment? And that's, all of them are key in varying degrees to success in implementing AI. And the assessment is not there to tell you like, ah, man, y'all are really in trouble, but here are the things you should focus on.
Sure.
And maybe here's some work you need to do first before just like pulling an AI tool off the shelf and trying to run with it. Maybe what you actually need to do is focus on, do you have canonical definitions of what things mean? Because I'm shocked the number of multifamily operators you go into, or even within an organization, they don't all agree on what the definition of occupancy is. So I say, what was occupancy last month? And there's 4 different numbers. Each one tells me a slightly different number because they define, termination dates, move out dates in different ways. They think about, free rent in different ways. So you get different numbers, and just having very basic things like, all right, everyone agree on a definition of what this means, is an example of kind of what we're looking at with the assessment.
I can just imagine the tenant example you mentioned where their number got scraped off the door and they're non-existent, but they are. That can impact the number depending on how they count that. Right.
Right. Like, yeah, do you count the ghost unit or not? Like, there's all sorts of.
It's fraud. Right. It's fraud.
Oh well, yeah, sure. You can call it that.
Well, yeah, David, I mean, you have more insight also on the acquisition side, right, in terms of that. So, like, what's some example, let's say, you've seen in terms of even just like assessing of that property and say, like, how is this a viable investment or a good move to partner up with whomever, yeah, is in that.
Yeah.
Uh,
I think that's one of the values that I think I add to a conversation like this is coming from an engineering background. And one of the benefits of an engineering background is that everything has to be documented. We have to document all the technology, how the technology works, what our plans are for the technology, the things that we failed. We document everything. And with kind of the advent, before AI, we had machine learning. Machine learning is better than AI in a lot of ways, but it's very expensive to do, and it can take a long time to do. AI kind of brings machine learning into a black box that it's quickly accessible and you get a lot of value out of it. But
Hmm.
you don't have to sit there and hire a bunch of PhDs for 3 years to possibly burn through millions of dollars and get nothing. So AI is kind of the accessibility of machine learning. But what this accessibility does is it provides you a bunch of tools, but it also transforms non-tech companies into tech companies. So before you think like, hey, I'm just a relational business where I make relationships with tenants and with people who sign leases, etc. You're now secretly a tech company, which means that you need to really document out what everything means and the processes you follow. There's two benefits for this. One of which is that you can feed it to an LLM and you can fine tune it to kind of help train your people, help make decisions, etc. It knows your personal business information. The
Hmm.
second thing that it does is, if you have a fund or a company and you eventually want to sell it, it's easier to sell things when you have documentation explaining why you do things and when you do it. And in 2025, since we're all tech companies, we need to all start documenting like we're engineers. What are our processes? How do we define our terms? How do we make decisions? And then when AI does something good, we know our documentation is good. And when it does something bad, we know that we need to improve it. From an acquisitions perspective, it kind of, I used to have clients that used to say, no, you need to have the steel phone up to your ear when you call people. Very slow to implement even, VoIP, people using their cell phones. Like if you couldn't feel the cold of the phone, of the cold Manhattan days against your ear, like you weren't making deals. But like now, but but at the expense of 10 times more calls, but it didn't really matter then because it was more a relationship business. Who cares? The head of real estate of such and such a tenant and you can make deals that other people who work 10 times harder can't. But now, kind of as a tech company, now the scalability is not just 10x but 1000x. You can move 1,000 times faster. You can have workers working during the downtime, and the value of the efficiency process outscales the value of the relationship business because these people form relationships with people who get deals done. Doesn't Who cares? Like you get 20 more deals done a year. These people will be your friends versus other people. So from an acquisitions process, people need to define what they're doing before you implement it into AI. From interesting, like we have to all function like we're some tech company out of the Bay Area and document everything if we want to be able to implement the technology. And I want to add maybe one more interesting thing. Who
Sure.
knows what the best AI technology is today? It could be one thing or another. In 3 months, it's going to be something different. In 6 months, it'll be a different thing. In 12 months, it'll be another thing. Whatever technology you're using today is going to forget whatever it is you've learned when you switch to another technology 6 months, 12 months from now.
Yeah.
Having your own internal documentation and self-learnings allows you to, like in engineering, we called it orthogonality, the ability to replace one piece of technology with another. You have to remain somewhat distant from the technology you imbibe, hold the data yourself, so you can quickly, transfer it to another piece of technology. And I think that's where, like, from acquisitions aside, who cares? The important part is you document your processes, you know what's important, and you're ready to be agile to move whatever is the new cool thing 3 months from now. Because what comes out in a year is going to be 5 times better than what comes out, today.
Yeah, I mean, if any, most of the leading AI companies today always kind of phrase that whatever you have today, just consider that the future is going to have something better, right? And to your point there, um, you give a very good example to even how some of these, let's say, more generic AI models, because let's face it, for many, it might be more common to think that, oh, well, how do I really put ChatGPT into this? And maybe that's what they've been exposed to versus dedicated, let's say, prop tech tools that have a model that's been trained to handle this kind of scenario. But as any prop tech tool, they want to ensure retention to their users. So they do design the tool to, say, onboard someone to stay on there. How we might come to what does it mean to export your insights to another model? How does that get packaged? I don't know. Is it like the longest markdown ever? Maybe. But in this, so like, and to bring back to the point you mentioned, the documentation, to make it like clear to anyone too, is that the beauty is that you don't actually have to maybe sit down, and maybe you have to develop the framework for how it's positioned, but you could just record the call with all the right stakeholders and make that conversation very clear. And that transcript can be used by AI to develop the documentation as well. And
I,
maybe
I,
have,
I, I'd like to kind of mention something here, just kind of as
sure.
that might be important, is documentation short and sweet is really nice. Like, as you begin to train these models, you start to run into context issues where if you give it too much information, it will begin to hallucinate and fail.
Hmm.
Like, I think like any type of documentation at first is great, whether it's a recorded call, a transcript, whatever it is. But I think that in the future, and I think it's always been this way, but I think it'll be more clear. Companies that make a lot of money do boring things really well. Like someone has to sit down and create the document. Someone has to sit there and say, can I turn this 1,500 characters into 1,000? That makes the AI, 33 to 50% more efficient, and it sucks, and nobody wants to do it, but it's a critical piece of the business. And right now, like if you sell a company like to a PE company or to someone you're being acqui-hired or whatever, they review your documentation. They say, hey, this person has a transferable process. I can fire half their staff and like continue to operate intelligently. I think there's going to be another point in the PE that says how quickly can this company be moved to a better AI efficiency solution. And that might also include length of documentation. How many characters does it take to explain to an AI what to do properly? And if I can buy two companies for $10 million and they both have the same quality of documentation, but one's 50% as long, like I assume that AI will hallucinate one-fourth the amount. Like I don't know if anyone's really quantitized this in a solution for PE, but I think it's something to consider in the future, like AI readiness, like how quickly can you sell your company to like a $1 billion company that will acquire you for 10 to 25 mil because they say like, hey, I have access to more expensive tools and they can quickly 4x their process with my fine-tuned AI model, and they built out their document. I think a race to the bottom for documentation from like scalability is eventually going to be like really critical, and someone needs to sit down and brutally type out those documents and think about them every day. It's just not fun, but it's what will make money, I think, in the future.
That to me, that sounds a bit like we're talking also about the diligence process a little bit too, which that kind of is its own subject point and category in terms of like what does that even mean for let's say the acquiring party, right? Or the diligence process in general for how things are parsed. Um, but it does scratch the surface a little bit, right, in terms of the importance there between those who provide it and make it available. I mean, at that point, it becomes part of your asset value, right? How prepared you
Yeah.
are to do that.
And
Um,
just
mhm,
to add one interesting little bullet here. I think all companies, and I work across a lot of industries and I see it clear. I work generally in high compliance industries, like real estate, healthcare, the government, stuff like this. But
mhm,
with AI, every company is becoming like an AI company in a way because they implement it, which means that they're slowly becoming a technology company, which means they need to start moving dollars away from middle managers to people who implement features.
mhm,
And as everyone becomes a technology company, they should look at what technology companies have been successful. Like, why has Stripe won payment processing? It has the best documentation, it's easiest to implement. Like, why did they beat out and crush First Data, Chase, Wells Fargo, etc.? Like, that's why. Why is
mhm.
ChatGPT winning the AI war? Because their API can easily be implemented by other developers and people can build wrappers around it. And I think as you become any type of industry or any type of company, you have to say, how can I follow the best practices of technical companies, knowing that eventually, like my company is going to become a tech company in some aspect. I could be biased because that's what I do, but like I think there's already a path to success that people can evaluate and say, how did people win their industry already? And then you can just emulate what the winners have done in the past.
I mean, we can easily frame that in that sense, because I mean, how someone wants to embrace the reality that they're a tech company, uh, even then, how do you define a tech company in the sense that is it about its operations, that it's completely based on systems that run its operations, right? Versus
If
it
you were to
being,
take away the technology, does their business shut down? That's what
mm,
companies I think are becoming. Like I even know nonprofits that do that help, like clean up ports around cities, right? So they make sure, that they're not poisoning the environment for kids that go to school in the port cities. But if you were to say, hey, you don't get technology this month, all their donors leave. They lose everything. So like that's kind of what I mean by a technology company. If you were to remove the tech, they no longer exist.
Brad, any second thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely understand, David, what you're saying in terms of the criticality of technology and the importance of investing in it. The area that for real estate operators that I tend to caution them against is they sometimes get in their heads that they're a technology company. And what that means to them is they need to build their own technology. And they get in a lot of trouble often doing that, where they build uh, ersatz versions of things that they would be better off buying off the shelf. And, because they like building it themselves and they think they can have more control over it. But what they end up with is something that it doesn't get maintained, it doesn't get updated. And you fast forward, used to be, 10 years. Now I think you fast forward 3 years and they have something that is fundamentally antiquated.
Yeah.
And they can't get anyone to maintain it. They don't have the margin to support it in that way. So I think when your definition of a technology business of like the technology is essential, we're 100% heading in that direction. And by that definition, I agree. I think if you asked a lot of people in finance, say, what is a technology company? They would say, well, it trades at a tech multiple and is
Yeah.
viewed like a technology company. And I think where you get into problems is some people in real estate convince themselves that their multifamily operating company is now a tech company and will trade at a tech multiple, and therefore they need to build a lot of proprietary tech versus just buying best in class tools off the shelf.
Yeah.
And I think that's a mistake.
I think you're absolutely correct. Like the difficulty in building these tools are incredibly expensive. And not only are they expensive, you have to find the right people, which is even harder. Like you can spend the money and still lose. And then you don't even know if you're ready for the next big thing. I think like the idea of the talk being AI ready for company like real estate's behind in technology, like banking is too, mostly because of compliance perspectives. It's actually hard to move forward quickly. But like the readiness for eventually, here's what's going to happen. There'll be companies that will say, I want to build AI tools for your industry because there's enough money there. And those are the tools you should use and you should be ready for. How do you get ready for them? You should know, you should have your data organized. Which of it's good, which of it's bad. If it's bad, throw it out. Like don't sit there and plug bad data into AI. You know, have your team trained and ready to like already use these types of tools, have the adaptability to sit there and trial these tools and have the business know how to make the right decisions and understand if you fail. I think like to sit there, I think for a lot of funds there's two solutions for them, or whether for a lot of companies they either want to be, maybe there's three solutions. One, they just want to make cash flow, they're part of the retirement program stuff they're giving to their kids. Two, they want to turn into a $1 trillion company, in which case, you maybe need to try to compete like a $1 trillion company. And then three, which is in most people's cases, they want to sell the company to someone who has more access to capital than they do. So they want to sell it to, a company that already is investing in this. So when these companies acquire you, they're looking for how quickly can I adapt their business model, to my elite technology that we have proprietary wise. And I think that's what AI readiness might mean to people. Be ready for future tools, or have your documentation and data ready so a company will buy you at a larger multiplier because they say, I can quickly plug you into my $200 billion technology system and I can turn your X into like 5X.
Right.
And I think, but if you have, like 5 or 6 buildings and you're using it, so that you don't have to work, that's, I wouldn't go out there and, throw away your kids' tuition to sit there and try to build some AI tool. Like, just enjoy, going out for a couple holidays or something.
Totally. And, one distinction, we teach an AI readiness workshop for multifamily operators. And, everyone always comes and the one thing they want are vendor lists. They're like, give me the vendor list. Like, who does this? Who does that? You know, point solutions, point solutions, point solutions. I'm like, sure, I could do that. So I started sending out lists of some of the top rated vendors in various categories, but I'm like, it'll be different in 6 months. It'll certainly be different in years. What matters is, you know, do you have access to your data? Do you understand what's there? Do you know where it lives? Is it interoperable when, you know, one of these solutions that you're using gets bought by a property management system and you're not on that property management system, and suddenly their integration with the one you're on doesn't quite work as well anymore? Can you switch over?
That's the exact right term, I think, for AI readiness. Interoperability. I called it orthogonality. It's the same thing. Like, how quickly can you, by separating your company into multiple different processes and workflows, having them well documented, and the ability to swap one piece of technology for another very quickly, I think will be how people win. Which, by the way, is probably less work than trying to, discover something for yourself.
Totally.
So, Brad, as you mentioned earlier with like the vendor listing, what intrigued me a bit is to think, like, for example, elevators, and the procurement of elevators, usually like in the operations and maintenance, right? They sign the maintenance contracts and they have assurances to know like this is who they're going to be dealing with and things like that. Are you seeing any shifts in the market where, let's say, from a procurement cycle perspective, that say the manufacturers or those providing the solutions are packaging O&M considerations in an easier way, let's say at an early stage of the procurement cycle to kind of offset some of that worry, or is there like some kind of intrigue there in terms of simplifying that? Because if we're talking about systems understanding that this is who you're going to go through, it makes a lot of sense to do it early on. So I'm curious, if is there anything there that you're seeing, yeah, develop?
It's a great question. The short answer is I'd love to see more of it, but some of these, you know, OEMs on building systems are the furthest behind the curve of anyone in operations. I would say the one exception there is access control. Some of the access control providers, you know, they're doing more interesting things, you know, particularly when it comes to like uh, self tours in multifamily, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Create, you know, and a lot of these are just purely programmatic workflows too, but at least you're seeing, okay, some of the access control systems have integrations with, you know, an Elevate OS or a VEN, where, you know, someone is approved to self tour, they're automatically provisioned access to the building and to the unit through the access control system. You're seeing
Mm-hmm.
some interesting things there, but if you're talking elevators, HVAC, you know, electrical systems, I'm just, you know, we're not seeing it yet. There are some interesting third-party tools that are creating sensors to monitor things like HVAC systems, you know, vibrations in elevators, all that, but they're usually not integrating with the manufacturers themselves.
Yeah. Not in a general perspective. I mean, I just know with some of the large elevator companies out there, that's a big part of their business success is about the fact that they tie into O&M and serve their contracts that way. Of course, they work with their third parties, but they're very well integrated in terms of like resources, education, and then the ability to perform on the tasks as needed. But yeah, I mean, if I can plug in a bit for on the manufacturing side, absolutely. Like manufacturers have way to go to integrating that cycle a little bit more. It's just that it's always very hectic because more often than not, the biggest thing is we want to make sure we're actually selling product and we have projects that we're installing them on. And so like almost everything else stops beyond that, most often than not to some degree. But then as things scale, yeah, they'll take on more responsibilities. But absolutely. Um, well, as we get closer to the end, I'm gonna double check here, see if we have any questions from the audience, which I doubt. But we do have a few viewers, so thank you for being here, and hopefully listening to all this so far has been pretty insightful. Um, well, I mean, at most at this point, we discussed quite a bit, and you know, hopefully there are some good takeaways. the biggest thing I want to kind of leave us off with is, and this is where I would love both of you to kind of, we'll create this like kind of bigger picture in some sense. So David, you're more on the acquisition side, right? And how you parse the market and understanding better opportunities. So what would be the biggest takeaway maybe? And the conversation here is more in the context of what is happening more these days, that you're noticing a shift from how things were done. So I'm just curious to position this more for anyone who is more experienced and operating to where their day to day they might not feel that difference, but you being in these functions and roles where you see things at a higher level, you observe some patterns and market dynamics that are maybe validating a few things. And obviously don't put anything that will hold you on the line or accountable for anything. So first of all, let's put the disclaimer of this is not financial advice, right? No medical advice, not any of that kind of stuff. And so, David, if you can share a bit on that sense, and then Brad, if you'd love to follow up on that from the operations side, kind of what drives that excellence for an operator today that you would kind of want to leave someone off with. So, David.
Sure. I think at a high picture, at a high level, like engineering is expensive, and I don't necessarily mean like building engineering. I mean just like engineering solutions. And the best way to engineer solutions is to build stuff so it's quickly replaceable. It can be quickly fixed, things like this. A lot of companies are put together kind of in a hack job where there's a problem now and you solve it quickly, and then it's still working, so you gloss over it. I think as the future kinds to unwind, people are going to need to somewhat deconstruct their business and better engineer it in a way so things are replaceable and quickly fixable. Things that I'm seeing now compared to even years ago is like, let's say that you're some type of company in New York, right? So you're paying $25,000 a month for a lease, to rent out office things. You have X number of employees, which are mostly commission only. You're throwing away a bunch of dollars and training a bunch of 20-year-old kids to sit there and talk to people who aren't going to pick up their phone, etc. That's just one thing. It's difficult to onboard people. It costs a lot of money to do anything. But I'm seeing movement to how can I hire people, in the middle of a country? How can I hire people overseas? How can I hire the smartest people in cities that are 1/10 the expense to live, but quickly onboard them through AI training and like AI software and get people up to speed quicker that don't need to come from like, you didn't need to go to like one of 10 schools and then like live in Manhattan for a year. Like, now I can sit there and I can hire from anywhere the brightest people and I can quickly onboard them to. I think that's what it is. How do you take your hiring process and create it like in a way that you can quickly replace with a better hiring process, or your cold calling? How can you replace that with a better cold calling process? Data procurement. How can I gut my company of like separate each one of my individual workflows and processes and improve it? It's a little expensive because you have to deconstruct it, you have to document it, you have to do some trial and error. But
Mm-hmm.
I think now I see companies that were previously very slow to make changes because you make $10 million, it covers a lot of bills. But it's becoming so competitive that people who are generally previously slow to make change are really considering making a lot of changes very quickly. And I think that's the whole mindset of it's who is quickly becoming it's what you do, which is how it is in almost every other industry. But it's happening very, very quickly in real estate, where the how do you say in English, the your reputation it used to be your reputation could last 10 years off some good deals. Like now your reputation, like no one cares about it. Is what do you do for me yesterday? Because everything, yeah, I think it's becoming much tighter in the AI space.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's right to build on that on the operational side from a, real estate operations, not known for its speed, not known for its agility. And that is challenging when you have a space like AI that is moving so fast,
It's
where
all
the
about,
vendors
yeah.
are succeeding today are not going to be best in class in 6, 12, 18 months. And what you can do, the capabilities that you can do today are different than what you're going to be able to do in 18 months. So the one word I would use to describe the firms that are succeeding today are agile. That is, they are able to move quickly and adapt to changing circumstances. And the ones that I think are struggling are not necessarily those that are underinvesting, but those that maybe are investing in the wrong direction, building big hairy proprietary stacks that are not going to do well with that interoperability when they need to move to a new platform. When something changes, they're stuck behind a walled garden of their property management system. Those are the
Yeah.
ones that are struggling the most. The ones that are doing well, it's also about that communication between the people who are making technology decisions and the folks on the ground. A lot of great technology pilots and implementations failed because they didn't get the buy-in and involvement of the people on the ground who would have to interact with those technology systems day to day. So the people who are doing it well understand the workflows on a building by building level, what's happening on each building, and get the local teams, get the site teams bought in and trained appropriately. And that's key, especially if you're running a national global real estate organization where you have thousands of people on site, maintenance techs, leasing specialists, property managers, what have you. Getting them not fearful of technology, not thinking it's going to replace their jobs, but thinking it's going to allow them to do more of the human work and less filling out fields
The,
in Yardi and Strata. That's
yeah.
the key.
So we're suddenly going to start seeing that the tab button on keyboards will start getting less of a mark because you don't have to go through all those fields as much. So that's always yeah. Yeah, 100%. I mean, that kind of consolidates it very well too on the talent piece as well. I mean, how education has its own realm too, right? For how we're getting educated around the use of AI and how curriculums are kind of shaping some of that as well. But what my point there being is that, as you mentioned, the talent aspect, I can only imagine that it becomes a thing where, as much as it is some training, it's also about just welcoming that sort of transition between here's someone from tech who can understand how data works and how to process it or put it into the right context for them to get what to do. And David, to your point on living in other places, what fascinates me a little bit is the real estate developments happening globally and positioning for higher quality of life, very accessible, walkable, and developing these areas where they're in economies where even if one just converts the currency to that local currency, they maximize that cost of living, right? Capability. And as we see travel, I can only imagine that this remote lifestyle thing becomes even more accessible. And not that it's a very discussed topic or it's happening at large scale, but it is definitely on an upper trajectory, right? Where, say, for example, I've met quite a few in real estate who say they would relocate to Thailand where there's a lot of development there. And from a cost of living perspective, like forget the rent you might be paying here versus what you paid there. So imagine being an operator or someone working with a company in very active markets in that sense, but remotely living in other places. One can always travel too. So apparently we're getting faster planes too, but not sure on the commercial side how fast that will happen. But it's just fascinating to see that there is a problem in flight speed, right? So teleportation might be a bit too far ahead. But yeah, that puts it in a very nice context. Well, David, Brad, thank you for this call in that sense. This is very insightful, and I think once we review the transcript too, we'll probably get quite a few nuggets. I'm very excited to package that and share it with folks following up to this. Um, Other than that, I have nothing else to add here, other than thanking y'all for all who's here. And I will segue a little bit here just to share. So, Brad, the resource you have with Thesis Driven, that's something I'm sharing here on a QR code. And essentially, it's there with the assessment that we were talking about. And we're very excited to kind of see how you maybe make use of it and find it practical. Definitely feel free to reach out to Brad and so on. David, people can definitely find you as well. You're on LinkedIn, and you know, anyone maybe they want to ask you something about acquisition. I'm sure. Hopefully, don't waste David's time. He's busy, so I want to make sure that's the thing. You have something serious, definitely reach out. Uh, but other than that, all I can say is thank you, and we'll wave goodbyes for now until next time and the next show. So, best I can share with the audience as well. November 4th, we're gonna do something with BioTwin. More will be shared on that as well. But alrighty, well, thank you all.